Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
Every Christmas in my family had the same script, as if we were trapped in some endless rerun that no one dared to stop, and the starring role was always mine because I paid for everything: flights for my brother and his wife who insisted on saving for the kids, gifts for my parents who claimed retirement had stretched their budget thin, and even the dinner reservation that somehow grew more extravagant every year. I never complained, not once, because I told myself it was love, it was peacekeeping, it was easier to throw money at the cracks than watch the whole thing split wide open. And for years, I believed they saw it that way too. The truth came to me in the ugliest way, through a careless mistake, a screenshot I wasn't meant to see. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, fingers already moving through the motions of the annual transfer, when my phone buzzed. A cousin had accidentally forwarded me the wrong image, one that captured a piece of their family group chat where I was the star attraction. The words stared back at me like a slap: holiday parasite. It was underlined with laughter emojis I couldn't see but could hear in my head, the kind of mean-spirited chuckle that people save for when the target isn't in the room. They said I paid because I had nothing else to offer. They said I needed the attention, that I turned generosity into theater. Parasite. That word sank in and made my chest tighten so hard I had to sit back in my chair and just breathe, because it wasn't disappointment, it wasn't even betrayal, it was humiliation, sharp and hot, like someone had just yanked the curtain down on a role I didn't know I'd been auditioning for. I thought back to the first Christmas it happened, when Dad had lost his job and Mom was crying quietly into the sink as if we wouldn't notice. I had just gotten my first big promotion, and covering dinner felt like the natural thing to do, a way to shield them from shame and remind everyone that family mattered more than bank accounts. No one argued when I reached for the check. The next year, it was easier for me to book the flights than hear the excuses about credit card debt. The year after that, I ordered gifts for the kids because my brother said he wanted Santa to still come, even if things are tight. And before I realized what had happened, it wasn't a choice anymore, it was expected. They sent me links to the restaurants they wanted. They texted me wish lists for gifts they knew I would never pick out myself. And I kept paying, thinking I was holding us together. But Parasite? That was something else entirely. That was the kind of word that revealed not only ingratitude, but contempt. It rewrote every Christmas in my head, made me wonder if the smiles at the table were real or if they were already laughing at me the moment I left the room. And as I sat there with the bank app glowing on my screen, my finger hovering over the confirm button that would move thousands of dollars into their holiday account, a wave of anger so strong surged through me that my hand actually trembled. For the first time in 15 years, I considered what it would look like to just stop. The thought was both terrifying and intoxicating. On one hand, I imagined the uproar, the phone calls, the guilt-tripping, the whispered accusations about how I had changed. On the other hand, I felt a pulse of raw satisfaction at the idea of letting them fend for themselves. I thought about how my brother drove a truck that cost more than my condo's down payment, how my parents had recently posted photos from a week-long beach rental, how my sister-in-law carried a purse that cost nearly half a paycheck, and how I had convinced myself they were struggling. Maybe they were never struggling. Maybe I had just been the easiest answer, the walking wallet who made it convenient to avoid hard conversations about money. I leaned back, staring at the frozen transfer screen, the numbers waiting to move with a single tap, and I felt something break open inside me. All those years I thought I was buying family harmony, maybe all I bought was their contempt. And, suddenly, it wasn't sadness anymore, it was clarity. I didn't have to go through with this. I didn't have to play the part they had written for me. I could stop the money right here, in this moment, and watch what happened when the parasite refused to feed. I let my hand rest on the mouse for a long minute, the cursor still hovering over confirm, and in that silence I could almost hear their voices, the ones that would soon flood my phone if I didn't follow through. But another voice was louder, my own, finally telling me the truth. If they saw me as a parasite, then maybe it was time they learned what life looked like without me attached. I clicked cancel and the transfer froze mid-motion. The room was suddenly so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of my refrigerator. I took a screenshot of the canceled transfer, the blank space where the money should have moved, and I stared at it with a strange mix of dread and glee. My heart was pounding, my palms damp, but I knew this was the beginning of something. For the first time in years, I wasn't paying the bill. For the first time, I was going to make them feel the weight of their own words. I didn't hit send yet. Not that night. I just sat with it, watching the image on my phone glow like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment. And as the hours stretched, I found myself whispering out loud, half in disbelief, half in triumph. Not this time. The morning after I froze the transfer, I made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon straight up and sat down with my laptop like I always do in December, only this time the routine shifted by a single degree that felt like a tectonic plate moving under a city. Because instead of pulling up the bank and executing the holiday bailout with the kind of muscle memory that never asks questions, I opened the thread my cousin had sent by mistake and read every single message slowly, as if I were peeling a label off a bottle to see what had really been poured inside me all these years, and with each line I could feel the careful story I had told myself about why I paid, and why that made me good, start to wobble like an ornament hooked to a dying branch. They had not said it once in a heat-of-the-moment joke, they had said it many times across many Decembers, passing the phrase holiday parasite back and forth like a party game they never expected me to hear, and there were other little knives disguised as compliments too, about how I performed generosity like a Broadway number, about how I needed the applause more than the rest of us needed the money, about how I made everything bigger than it had to be so she can save the day. And as I scrolled, I began seeing each Christmas as if I were an outsider at the window, noticing how I made sure stockings were stuffed, how I prepaid the waitress so no one would fight over the check, how I pretended not to notice my brother's wife slipping the gift receipts into her purse, as if she might need the cash back later, and how I laughed too loudly to cover the fact that I was trying to keep everyone from falling apart. It is a particular kind of nausea when gratitude gets recast as neediness, and it is an even stranger feeling to realize that the people who benefited most from your generosity still found a way to feel superior while taking it. So while the coffee went cold, I did the inventory that adults do when they are done lying to themselves, tallying the years I covered flights, the years I paid off Dad's copay without telling him, the years I picked presents for kids whose parents texted me sizes at 2 in the morning like I was the warehouse manager of a small charity, and the years I told dates that I needed Christmas week free because my family did it big, which is another way of saying I made the thing big so they did not have to handle it at all. Somewhere between the second and third reread, my phone pinged with a calendar reminder I had forgotten to delete, a cheerful little nudge telling me to complete annual transfer by Friday, and I almost laughed at how obedient I had become to habits that served everyone but me, because I had coded my life to remind me to finance the same people who called me a parasite for doing it. When I finally stopped studying the thread like a forensic accountant of my own humiliation, I opened the banking app again and looked at the canceled transfer with the blank space where the movement should have been. And a plan unspooled itself with the smooth certainty of a ribbon pulled from a gift, not because I am vengeful by nature, but because revenge sometimes looks exactly like an adjustment to reality. And I had decided reality needed adjusting in a way that would be unmistakably clear to the people who thought they could keep cashing me like a holiday tradition. The first move had to be simple and undeniable, so I drafted a new transfer with the amount set to $1 and the memo line reading, in the same tone they used for me, from your holiday parasite. And I set it to repeat once a day for the next 12 days, a tiny ghost of the 12 days of Christmas that would land in their notifications like a drip from a faucet they could not tighten, reminding them with hilariously petty precision that the river had become a drop, and the drop came with a label. Before I hit confirm on the little performance art piece, I took care of the logistics that would otherwise be used against me as proof of sabotage, because I am many things, but I am not careless. So I logged into the reservation for Christmas Eve and removed my card from the pre-authorization while leaving the booking intact under my brother's name. Then I shifted the delivery addresses for the bigger gifts I had already ordered to pick up at store, with identification required, which meant no packages would mysteriously land on doorsteps like Santa had a standing contract with my credit limit. And I went into the shared GIF spreadsheet and deleted my column so cleanly that the remaining cells moved left and made it look like there had never been a column for me at all. None of this required an announcement, and none of it needed an apology, because the loudest part was going to be the proof of absence, and the more quietly I did it, the more undeniable the silence would sound when they reached for what they believed was theirs by tradition and found only air. The attack came sooner than I expected, which told me they had grown accustomed to an invisible hand smoothing their lives by noon, because at 11 my mother called with the upbeat tone she uses when she wants something to feel normal, asking whether the transfer had gone through because your father was about to check the account for the deposit we always do, and I said that I was in the middle of something and would call back, which was true in the most satisfying sense. Then my brother texted a screenshot of the reservation that now showed payment due upon arrival, as if I had cut power to the house in the middle of a football game, and he wrote that it was confusing. Then followed up with a message that did not try to hide the accusation beneath a question, telling me I was being dramatic again and that I could save the showboating for Instagram. I let the screen go dark without an answer, because silence, when applied at the right temperature, is not passive at all, it is strategic, and with my thumb hovering over the banking app, one knew exactly what kind of message would slice through the noise without me having to raise my voice. I executed the $1 transfer and watched the confirmation bloom like a tiny, perfect bruise. Then I selected the screenshot of the canceled big transfer from last night and dropped it into the family thread with no text at all, letting the image and the memo line I had scheduled do the speech for me, which is a style choice I recommend to any woman who has coached her tone into palatability for 2 decades only to be called a parasite when she uses her money to maintain everyone else's comfort. The typing bubbles started immediately, my cousin first with the fake soft diplomacy of someone who did not know how much I knew, then my mother with a paragraph about tradition and togetherness and how I was breaking the chain, then my brother with a short, sharp accusation about me loving control more than I loved family, and finally my sister-in-law with a condescending note about how sometimes generosity becomes moral debt and that isn't healthy, which would have been a useful concept last decade. Not this morning. I put my phone face down and laughed out loud in a way that did not feel cruel so much as it felt aligned, because the revenge was not elaborate, it was neat, and for once it fit the crime. I let the messages stack into a tower I did not plan to climb. Then, for the small flourish that would be both clever and impossible to misinterpret, I set a second $1 transfer to each of them for the next day with the memo reading, "Service fee for processing your opinion," and I flipped the mute switch so the notifications would not pull me into a debate I had already won by refusing to finance it, and just before I stood up to pour the cold coffee down the sink I added one last quiet cut that made me grin at my own pettiness, which was to rename the family group in my phone from Christmas Crew to Accounts Receivable, a private joke that would never land anywhere but inside my pocket, where it warmed me like a smuggled flask. By the time I reached the sink, the phone was buzzing like a trapped insect under a glass, and in that hum I could hear the opening notes of a new holiday tradition forming around a truth I had finally decided to respect. If they wanted a feast, they could learn how to cook, pay, and wash the dishes without me. And as the water ran over the cup, a new text preview crawled across my screen from my mother with a subject line so heavy it could crack tile, which read, "You have ruined Christmas again." And I dried my hands slowly because the reply I was about to send was not words at all but a single image that would land like a gavel. The bank confirmation for the 12 daily transfers of $1, each with the graceful memo I had chosen, ready to march across their screens like a carol they would not be able to stop hearing. By late afternoon the group thread had swelled into something that looked less like a conversation and more like a parade of competing alibis, each relative rushing to establish a version of history where my wallet had simply drifted toward theirs by some natural law of family gravity and not because I was the one quietly picking up pieces no one else wanted to touch. And while my screen lit up with apologies that were not apologies, phrases like, "You know we appreciate you," tucked between barbs about my timing and my need for drama, I brewed another pot of coffee I did not intend to drink and let myself listen to the voicemail my mother had left at midday. The one where her voice began in that light sing-song that passes for grace in our house and ended on a rasp that was closer to accusation than grief, telling me I was ruining Christmas again. Which would have been funny if it were not such a tidy summary of the long con we had all been running on each other, because if I was the one ruining it now, then what exactly had I been doing all those years when I took calls in parking lots to negotiate late fees, when I double-wrapped presents to disguise outlet tags, when I lied about discounts that never existed just to make everyone feel like they were participating in some great bargain instead of acknowledging that I was the bargain. I replayed the last 30 seconds twice because there was a tell in her phrasing, a clipped mention that your father already told Uncle Mark we could cover the oysters, and the word already stood out like a lamp switching on in a dark room. Because it meant plans had been made on my behalf with no consultation, and the offering had been announced as if the animal had willingly walked to the altar, which is the precise moment when something inside me stopped being sad and became procedural. Procedural is where I am best, and when the emotional weather clears enough for me to see the map, I can move through a plan with the kind of calm that makes other people nervous. So I started by calling the restaurant where the Christmas Eve reservation had been strategically placed at the exact hour that guarantees maximum inconvenience if anything goes wrong, and I asked for the manager. And in a voice so even it sounded like velvet, I explained that the booking contact needed to be updated to my brother's full name and number, that the pre-authorization tied to my card should be removed immediately, and that a deposit would be required to hold the private room by the end of the next business day. Because the party had grown since last year and the house rule, I had learned in my research that morning, permitted the restaurant to require a non-refundable hold for groups above 15, which we were by several chairs and several egos. The manager was gracious and professional in that way only a seasoned December manager can be, and within minutes she had sent a polite email to my brother's inbox explaining the new terms, and she copied me so that the timestamp would live in a place no one could dispute later. And then she did something generous that I had not asked for but appreciated anyway, which was to offer a waitlist guest the room if the deposit did not arrive by the deadline. So no harm would come to them, and no harm would come to me except the harm of being accused of orchestrating reality, which, frankly, I was. While that piece moved toward its own inevitable conflict, I opened a fresh spreadsheet and began building a ledger that would make any auditor smile and any ungrateful relative sweat. Not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because clarity is a kind of mercy that sometimes looks like a courtroom, so I titled the document with a name that made me laugh out loud in my kitchen: Host Your Own Holiday. And across the top, I laid out 15 years of line items with dates, vendors, and exact categories, flights and lodging and gifts, and the infamous seafood tower they all love to order after the third cocktail when the check is a theoretical problem, because I am sitting there, and into the cells I plugged numbers pulled from old emails and archived receipts. Each one a small breadcrumb of a life lived trying to keep a show running long after the actors forgot where the stage lights came from. At the bottom, I added a line for courtesy gratuities paid in cash, because that is what generosity looks like when it is not photographed, and when I totaled the columns and watched the number roll up like a measuring tape, I felt the quiet thud of a truth landing. This was not a phase or a tradition. This was a ledger with a balance. The beauty of modern tools is that they allow a person to present an argument without raising her voice. So I dropped the spreadsheet into a freshly created group ledger app that every adult in our circle already used for ski weekends and tailgates when they could be bothered to settle up, and I labeled the new group, Accounts Receivable, Christmas. And I assigned each line to the appropriate parties in neat proportions that even a stubborn person could not call unfair: parents for the dinners they hosted in name only, brother and sister-in-law for the flights, and the boutique gifts they posted on social media like they had fallen from a generous sky, cousins for the hotel rooms I had quietly secured when pipes burst 2 years ago, and the extended crew for the extras I had been bullied into calling traditions, like the specialty bakery cake that is apparently a non-negotiable symbol of love. I set the due date to Christmas Eve at noon, which would be late enough to give adults time to behave like adults and early enough to trigger consequences if they preferred theater, and because I am not a monster, I unchecked the public option so that only members could see their balances. which protected their dignity while removing their deniability. Before I shared the link, I added one more tab called Notes, and in a single paragraph I laid out the thesis as kindly as I could manage without lying, writing that generosity without respect becomes exploitation, that tradition without consent becomes obligation, and that I was no longer able to carry a role that required me to be both invisible and endlessly available. Then I attached the screenshot of the phrase that had started this whole corrective process. Holiday Parasite, sitting in a bubble next to the name of a cousin who now claimed she did not mean it that way, and beneath it I wrote only 4 words, which I chose carefully because they would be repeated and examined. This is my boundary. I copied the link, I dropped it into the family thread, and I put my phone down on the table as if it were a bell I had been allowed to ring at last. The reactions arrived with the speed of a smoke alarm. My brother first with a volley of messages about how tacky it was to invoice family, and how I was turning love into math. My mother with a softer, but heavier plea about what people will think. My father with a single sentence that hurt more than the others, because it was honest, I did not know how much it really was, and then, after a pause long enough to register as strategy, my sister-in-law with a suggestion that we could split the big things but that I should still handle the logistics like usual, because I am so good at it, which landed like a compliment wrapped around an ankle weight. I ignored them all and simply forwarded the restaurant's deposit email to the thread with a thumbs-up icon removed, because I know better than to decorate a point, and I waited and waited. And then watched as the Ledger app began showing little green check marks beside 2 names, cousins who wanted no part of a public meltdown, followed by a 3rd check from an aunt who has always understood how money moves feelings around a table, and while the big players stalled and sputtered and tried to move the conversation to side texts where they could recast me as unreasonable, the clock in the ledger ticked toward its own quiet bell. For the flourish that would end the day with the kind of precision that feels like justice, I scheduled a message through the Ledger app to send automatically at 11:59 on Christmas Eve if any balances remained unpaid. A message that would be delivered not to the family thread but to the restaurant manager's inbox and would read, in the most courteous language, that the booking contact had failed to provide the deposit by the stated deadline and that the private room could be released to the waitlist guest, and I added a second automated note to the family ledger that, at the same minute, would gently mark any unpaid lines as rolled forward with interest. Not because I planned to collect a dime, but because sometimes the most effective revenge is to mirror the very structure people use to keep you small, and by the time I closed my laptop and turned off the kitchen light, the plan was humming on its own like a machine that did not require my hands anymore, leaving me with the single indulgence I allowed myself that night, which was to pour a glass of a wine I had been saving for a celebration and raise it to the quiet, not because I was finished, but because I had finally started. The closer Christmas crept, the louder the silence became between me and the people who had once assumed that my generosity was as dependable as the date printed on the calendar, and what fascinated me was not their outrage, but their disorientation. Because when you take away the one person who has always quietly absorbed the cost of other people's comfort, you discover just how little they have learned about providing for themselves, and I could almost taste their panic in the short-clipped texts that began arriving in the middle of the night when they thought I might be too tired to respond, messages filled with backtracking explanations and half-hearted admissions that never once reached the level of a genuine apology. My brother sent a string of questions disguised as jokes. Did I forget to press a button? Did my bank freeze the transfer? Was I trying to spice things up this year? As if the entire structure of our holidays could be reduced to a punchline if he delivered it with enough bravado. My mother tried another strategy, sending sentimental photos from past Christmas mornings where I sat in the background with wrapping paper piled at my feet, insisting that we are a family first, money second, while conveniently ignoring the fact that family second only looked so joyful because my money had made family first look effortless. And then, when none of these ploys thawed the ice, my sister-in-law broke the unspoken rule and sent a message that carried the kind of venom you only release when you believe the target cannot retaliate. You wanted this role. Don't act like we forced you. Because you thrive on control, and without your little show you have nothing. That sentence landed differently, not because it was true, but because it revealed the twisted narrative they had built to make sense of their own dependence, and for a brief moment I found myself wondering if, on some level, I had helped script it by never saying no, by smiling through clenched teeth when the bill slid across the table, by performing gratitude for being allowed to carry the load without complaint. Yet, even in that uncomfortable recognition, there was clarity, because I understood that silence would remain my sharpest weapon, and I was not going to let their rewrites become the final draft. Instead of arguing, I let them stew in the gap I had carved into the tradition, and I watched from a distance as the carefully rehearsed choreography of our family's holiday machine began to misfire. The restaurant manager, now armed with my brother's email address as the sole contact, reached out with professional efficiency to remind him of the unpaid deposit, and when he ignored her, the gentle but firm follow-up arrived 24 hours later, accompanied by a deadline he could no longer push onto my shoulders. I imagined the moment he opened it, the dawning recognition that the safety net was gone, and though I was not there to witness his face, I savored the thought of the quiet curse that must have slipped out when he realized he would either have to part with his own money or confess to the family that the room was at risk of being lost entirely. Meanwhile, the ledger app ticked like a metronome, and the little green check marks multiplied as cousins, aunts, and even one uncle decided to pay their portions rather than get dragged into the mud, which only increased the pressure on my brother and parents, who were left exposed by their refusal to acknowledge the bill. The beauty of the system I had built was that it transformed private sacrifices into public accountability, and with each new check mark I could feel the balance of power shifting, not because I wanted dominance, but because I wanted honesty. And for the first time in my adult life, I was getting closer to it. Still, the resistance remained fierce. My mother's voice messages grew shakier, oscillating between guilt and accusation, telling me I was choosing pride over love, that Christmas memories could not be measured in dollars, that I would regret fracturing the family. She never once said she was sorry for the name they had used behind my back. She never once admitted that the entire holiday had functioned like a theater built on the labor of one actor who was never given billing. And so, as painful as it was, I held the line, reminding myself that their discomfort was not cruelty but consequence, and that sometimes the only way to teach people what something is worth is to stop giving it away for free. The evening before Christmas Eve, my phone rang with my brother's name lighting the screen, and for a long minute I simply let it buzz, because I already knew what he wanted to say, that I had pushed things too far, that I was embarrassing him, that I was jeopardizing the one night a year when we all sat at the same table. When I finally picked up, his tone was sharp and defensive, and within 30 seconds he delivered the line that crystallized everything, shouting that I was the real parasite because I fed off their need for me. That without my annual performance I would have no identity at all. I listened in silence until he ran out of steam, and then I said only one sentence before hanging up. If I am the parasite, then maybe it is time you find out what it feels like to host the body. The click of the call ending echoed in my kitchen louder than his rant had in my ear, and for the first time in years, I felt no tremor of guilt afterward. That night, as snow dusted the street outside and neighbors strung last-minute lights across their porches, I poured myself another glass of wine and opened the reservation email from the restaurant, scrolling to the section where the words, "Deposit not received," had been highlighted in red, and I took a screenshot of the notice and set it aside in my gallery, knowing it would become the next arrow in my quiver when the inevitable plea came tomorrow. I leaned back in my chair, imagining them scrambling to rearrange plans, to decide who would pay, to argue about fairness, and in that chaos I found a strange serenity, because revenge did not feel like fire or fury, it felt like stillness, the calm of stepping out of a storm you had mistaken for air. I knew the next 24 hours would stretch like a taut wire, and I knew they would try again to draw me back into the role I had finally abandoned, but I also knew that the quiet weapon of my refusal was sharper than anything I could say out loud, and as I turned off the lights and left the house in darkness, I carried with me the unshakable knowledge that this year, for the first time, they would sit down to a holiday of their own making. And they would taste exactly what it meant when the parasite stopped feeding On Christmas Eve morning, I woke before the alarm, not because I had anywhere to be, but because the weight of the silence I had chosen now pressed into the room like a second presence. And as I lay there, I realized that for the first time in 15 years, I was not racing through a mental checklist of logistics, not calculating tips in advance, not reminding myself to bring envelopes of cash so the servers would not be stiffed, and not trying to anticipate the moment when someone would hand me the check with a sigh of rehearsed reluctance. Instead, I brewed coffee without hurry, let it cool to the right temperature, and sat at the table with my phone in front of me, screen dark, knowing that the storm was already spinning on the other side, that the calls and messages would arrive with the same inevitability as the calendar date, but also knowing that I had no obligation to open the door and invite it in. By mid-morning, the first frantic message came from my brother, the kind of short, clipped text that revealed he was trying to write while juggling phone calls from the restaurant and whispered arguments with his wife. And though I had no proof of the scene unfolding in his kitchen, I could imagine it clearly. The raised voices, the irritation masked as logistics, the frantic search for a credit card with enough room to cover a deposit he had never thought he would actually have to pay. 10 minutes later, a voicemail from my mother appeared, this one shorter than the others, her voice trembling as she said only that I was breaking her heart, and in the background I caught the muffled sound of my father's voice asking if the room was gone already, which told me everything I needed to know about who had taken responsibility and who had not. I let the phone buzz itself to exhaustion, the way a trapped insect eventually tires itself against a window pane, and I poured another cup of coffee. While the Ledger app quietly updated to show 2 more relatives settling their shares, unwilling to be caught in the line of fire once the truth became unavoidable. The deadline for the deposit passed at noon, and with a kind of ceremonial precision, I opened the reservation email to find the message I had expected, the one confirming that the private room had been released to the next guest in line. And I saved the screenshot as carefully as someone might fold a letter for safekeeping. An hour later, my brother called again, his voice furious and cracked, accusing me of orchestrating humiliation, insisting that I had wanted this collapse all along, that I thrived on drama, and when I did not answer, he followed up with a text that landed heavier than he probably intended. "You've ruined everything, and you've proved what we always said, you're just a parasite." The repetition of that word did not wound me the way it had the first time. Instead, it hardened into proof that silence was the only response left, because to argue would be to pretend we were still on the same page, when in reality we were standing on opposite shores of a river that could not be crossed anymore. That evening, while they scrambled to salvage a dinner in a smaller space or perhaps in someone's living room without the polished sheen of a restaurant staff smoothing over every discomfort, I dressed in something simple and warm and walked to a small restaurant near my house, one I had passed countless times but never entered because December was always claimed by obligations elsewhere. The host seated me at a quiet table near the window, and I ordered a meal that needed no explanation, no justification, no shared check to argue over, and when the glass of wine arrived, I lifted it in a silent toast to the reflection staring back at me from the glass pane. Before I took the first sip, I pulled out my phone, selected the screenshot of the canceled transfer, and paired it with the new image of the empty reservation notice, then sent both to the family thread with a single line typed beneath, "Cheers to parasites." I pressed send, turned the phone face down, and let the moment settle. The replies arrived within minutes, angry bursts of words, desperate appeals, accusations woven with pleas, but I did not read them, because the point had never been the argument. The point had been the absence, the refusal, the removal of myself from a role I had never truly consented to play. As I finished the meal and stepped out into the cold, the streetlights glowing against the snow, I felt no triumph and no regret, only the strange, steady calm of someone who has stopped feeding a story that was never hers to begin with. I knew there would be consequences, that holidays might fracture permanently, that relatives might paint me as selfish for years to come, but I also knew that none of it mattered as much as the quiet conviction I carried home with me that night. When I finally slipped into bed and let the darkness fold around me, the phone still muted on the nightstand, I understood something that had been hovering at the edges of my thoughts all along. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing. And sometimes the loudest answer is silence itself, leaving behind a question that no one else can resolve.